Before we dive into today's episode, please note the views and opinions shared by our guest are entirely his or her own and do not reflect the positions of any organization with which he or she may be affiliated, past or present. All insights represent his or her personal perspectives only.
Hi, welcome and grüezi to a new episode of Governance Unplugged, Internal Audit, Risk and Controls. The podcast where we explore the real stories, insights and challenges behind internal audit, risk and governance. I'm your host, Thomas Michel, joining you from Switzerland with 25 years of experience in senior positions in internal audit and risk management. In this episode, we look at the future of assurance and how the three lines model is evolving as roles blur, expectations rise, and machines can do in seconds what used to be done in weeks in the past. I'm personally very excited about this conversation because it touches the core of what we as assurance professionals stand for: trust, independence, and relevance. Our guest today is Martin Studer, with nearly 3 decades of experience and a true rock star of our profession. Martin has built and led internal audit and risk advisory on a global scale, including serving as the head of global internal audit at Ernst & Young, and later as the head of group audit at Zurich Insurance Group. Today, as the founder and general partner of Blue Rain Partners Group, he brings a forward-looking view that connects governance, impact investing, and regeneration. He describes his approach through a simple yet profound lens. What if business became our most trusted platform for regeneration? Martin, it's a real honor to have you with us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And frankly, it's also great for me to stay connected with the assurance profession. In my view, assurance is the backbone of all risk-taking. It never left me. I never left it. You covered pretty much the stages I covered in my professional career. If I would break it down maybe in some blocks of learning, it would include at the very start in university, I trained as an economist and in management. So this gave me a bit of an understanding for the entire world, how it's organized. At that time, I couldn't fully make sense out of it. Now I can. Then later on, I became a CPA. This allowed me to learn to read businesses through a financial lens. And I think that's a skill that is indispensable when you run business or influence business at any kind. Then as a manager, first locally, multinationally and globally, an advisor and a consultant at that time, I truly understood how organization growth and scaling comes in certain waves. And maybe the skill I acquired there is to not only read businesses through a financial lens, but to read people and to better understand what motivates them, what keeps them from performing well, and to eventually influence that. So the move into internal audit and the head of internal audit roles I had for the two organizations you mentioned was more of a logic step. When you fully embrace what business is doing, going into a governance activity, I think is truly rewarding as it gives your experience a new layer. To understand how this kind of backbone of a business really is organized and should work both in a regulated or non-regulated environment, across different cultures, sizes of companies, and across industries. So this is really what brought it together. And for me, then going into an entrepreneurial challenge is really the coronation of a business career. While you go back into a small environment, you have to master all those disciplines I mentioned and bring it all together. In investing, in advising, in building, and that's what we do for our living on the fields we chose around sustainability, biodiversity, longevity and aging, and finally technology transformation and sustainable change in society. So that's a little bit the storyline across the positions you mentioned, Thomas.
Before we dive into the heavy topics of today, let's start with something a little bit lighter. Martin, I would love to kick things off with a few quick fire questions to give our listeners a better sense of who you are as a person. So number one, after a long demanding week, what's your favorite way to unwind and recharge?
Probably the moment I appreciate most is Friday, 7 p.m. when we gather our family for what we call apéro time. So after work drinks. So our kids are all adults, and so we still have this habit or this tradition that Friday at 7 p.m. that's open house, and we do that in standing. So we have a standing table, which is then filled with delicacies from different cultures. We are a bit of a patchwork family from different cultural backgrounds. And then it's the time to talk, to share stories, to debate sometimes. That's our forum in that sense. And we enjoy that. It oftentimes happens that it goes past midnight and we touch on so many things and gel a little bit as a family. Things I maybe haven't done too much when I was heavily traveling in my earlier phases of my career.
And number two, if you could have dinner with any people, dead or alive, who would they be and what would you most want to ask them?
I probably would go to meet with people who are still alive, because then a conversation has more meaning, as they can still also learn from the conversation, and not only I would learn from them. Choosing one or two, probably one who impacted myself for 40 decades is Patti Smith, the rock star. I heard her first time in the early 80s, and I was touched by her song, The People Have the Power. And for me, she was just larger than real in the way how she could express thoughts. No one would do the same way. Then I saw her on stage when she delivered to the Nobel Prize giving, where Bob Dylan received a Nobel Prize and didn't show up, but she would sing there and drop the line. And there she was such a humble person to ask for permission to do again and apologize. And I thought that was quite impressive to see someone who's been on stages entertaining tens of thousands of people and then still have the humility to give such an act of, I would say, kindness in that sense and self-reflection. So I would be keen to have a dinner with her to see where it takes the conversation. And then maybe second, Marina Abramovic is maybe the most outstanding performing artist alive. And she always would do things most others would never dare to do. So she brings a lot of courage in art she creates. And I would wonder how she brings that courage and how she prepares for what may happen during her performances, which is always uncharted water. And I'm deeply impressed by people who dare to do things others shy back.
Thank you, Martin. I think your answers bring a wonderful human touch to our conversation. And I think it's time to jump into the topic of today's podcast. So, Martin, let's begin truly at the very beginning. Why does internal audit exist, and why do internal auditors exist? Who has an interest in the existence of things such an internal auditor beyond the family they basically feed?
Wow, that's a good way to start. Great way to frame it, Thomas. Maybe I start with the easier one. Why does internal audit exist? I can maybe offer two perspectives here, more optimistic one and maybe one which gives more to think. And I probably do the second first. I would derive the necessity for internal audit more from a behavioral science perspective. Great minds like Daniel Kahneman, who was a psychiatrist, but then was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. He was one of those lead figures in making and building behavioral science to the core of management tactics or management competence. And what he framed nicely is that the human kind is programmed for laziness. And that was one of the causes that made humans survive, because they were lazy. They didn't want to burn a lot of glucose because they never would know when they get their next snack into their fingers and from there into their mouth. So they had to stay quite calm and silent to not get kind of observed by wild animals that could make them burn more calories than necessary. So he found out that whenever a human makes a decision, it's first of all driven by that kind of reflex of being lazy, and that goes into brain work as well. So whenever you can rationalize, whenever you can extrapolate from an insufficient sample size, you would do it. There is a way to also go into the details and do the heavy brain work, he would find, and he would say that's the slow system where you focus, but it also brings a disadvantage. In the moment when you focus, you blind out all what is left and right, so you don't see the full picture. You only drill deep. And those two capacities, in fact, in my view, bring the necessity for internal audit. He would also expand and say, in larger groups and cohorts, you have this group think, which is then similar. The group tries to be lazy. You depend on what others do or don't do, or you say, I thought others did. And so management effort oftentimes is driven by the lazy component. Mm-hmm. You try to do things fast, efficient, and you jump the row in some way or form. And if you go into detail, you blind out what would be important to observe anyway. So that's basically in a nutshell what he brings forward in his well-known book, Thinking Slow and Fast. Mm-hmm. I think it's a title. So that's the one side. I think he would say you need to stand outside the operating of the process to observe deficiencies, to observe shortcomings. And internal audit as an independent function stands outside at the sideline to some extent and is well suited to observe shortcomings that can lead to fraud, non-compliance or other deficiencies. The other element is also well researched, and I would refer to the principal agent theory, where you have kind of a distribution, a segregation of duty, a distribution of duty which doesn't play to a great outcome. The principal who brings the risk capital delegates roles to management who do not own the capital but have the idea, I would say, to do a good job, to deliver on the mandate, but also to increase their own wealth or to reach their own intents. And then as you divide that in larger companies to lower levels, to subsidiary levels and lower management groups, divisions, obviously that agent principle starts watering down the entire organization. So it can well be that the intent of the founder, the intent of the shareholder, the intent of the supervisory body is not fully implemented in and across the entire system. And that's why internal audit is important as the only instrument in the hands of the principal. And therefore, I think it's unavoidable. It's a necessity to have an internal audit activity. So the answer to the first one is easy. Why does internal audit exist? In summary, because those who are involved in process either cannot see or do not want to see or follow different intent, at least to some extent. And that's well researched. It's not my opinion. It's well researched.
Martin, I think you highlight perfectly how the natural gap between principal and agent cannot be closed by processes and controls alone. True independence allows internal audit to recognize misalignment, address conflicts of interest, and guide the organization back towards its objectives. Far from being academic, this is one of the most practical and compelling reasons why our profession is indispensable.
Absolutely. So I think now as we establish this one, let's drill into why do internal auditors exist. I think this is a more tricky thing because, well, you know, when you would interview, let's say, teenagers and ask for their dream profession, some would say, I'd like to become a rocket scientist. Some others would say, I'd like to become a gardener. So everyone has dreams. I don't think ever would a teenager raise the hand and say, I'd like to become an internal auditor, notably in the insurance industry. And later on, when you are not a teenager anymore, let's say you're in university and you do the same, no one would say, oh, I'd like to become an internal auditor in public service. That would be a showstopper for every party conversation. So why is that? Why does internal audit or do internal auditors have that stigma? And I've got an idea because it doesn't have to be this way. It has to do with the learning curve internal auditors typically follow along their career. Mm-hmm. And this is compared to other professions engaged in the business processes, oftentimes, unfortunately, a rather flat learning curve. So my hypothesis is if an individual is smart and trains themselves and stretches themselves and grows visibly, as seen not by themselves, but by the people around them, internal audit can be an utterly sexy and attractive profession, and internal auditors would be utterly sexy and attractive if they follow that kind of path of a steep learning curve. And now, in a nutshell, to your question, why do internal auditors exist? I think those have a right for existence who grow in lockstep with the growth and the energy you would observe in management ranks in general. So there, I think, see elements of what auditors do that can be easily replaced. I guess we'll discuss later on the outlook for internal audit. But those auditors who stretch themselves, they will attract opportunities, they will keep growing, and they will have a lot of fun as well in what they do.
Martin, what do you think? Is part of our challenge simply the name of our profession, internal auditor, which already sounds a bit dry to many people? Do you think that if we described what we do as something like business risk analyst or business risk advisor with a slightly more attractive title, it would help us to bring more people into our profession?
I don't think so. Whenever I was in an internal audit activity, first as a consultant, then as I was a mentioned, I was a managing partner. I was asked to build an internal audit. Mm-hmm. And then later on, where I was the head of group audit for a large listed company, I was always proud of being an internal auditor while I was doing these roles. But I pushed the envelope. And I think it has more to do with who internal auditors are. What they do is clearly established. They provide assurance. They should provide assurance. The company can depend on who they are, changed significantly, I think, and will change radically in future. I think there are maybe two phases in a professional life where ambitious professionals should engage. The first one is at the start of a career, where you can really go onto a steep learning curve. You're like a sponge, taking everything in. Mm-hmm. So if you bring that mindset, internal audit is a medal of honor. It's not a label you should hide. And then towards the end of your career, when you worked at group level, when you know how management operates, when you've been part of management, while you bring the professional experience of an audit process, of an audit activity, it's a profession. So I would by no means try to erase audit from your label. It tells what you do.
So are you saying an internal auditor should start their career in internal audit, leaving internal audit, working in a corporate role, and then come back having grown in a corporation at a more senior level?
I would advise, yes. And there are such models. I would not recommend to just go in for a couple of years. It should be a serious block of experience that help the individual to make a certain learning. So I would probably advise to start and stay at least for 4 or 5, eventually 6 years. That's long enough to develop the profile that allows to lead audits and to face off with management at the CEO levels for subsidiaries or divisions. And then maybe to rotate off into the business and to grow a deeper understanding for the pressures a business typically has to operate with and absorb, and then later on eventually to come back. So I think a meaningful career should bring certain rotations that allow to gain different types of experience. It can be functional. So you do audit and then you go into a business function. It could be kind of geographic. You start in a certain geography and then you relocate to acquire deep insights into different cultures. Or it could be kind of business function-wise. You go from a third line of defense into second or first line and then back into second to round your profile, while you always, that's why I think it's great to do that at the beginning of the career. Auditing is a profession. It provides you with a certain rigor, a certain mindset, how you approach things, how you build hypotheses, how you test hypotheses for accepting or rejecting the claims. That's a methodology. It's a profession. And if you don't learn that at the beginning of your career, later on, it's harder to embrace that.
I think this is a fascinating topic. Could you imagine a model where internal auditors remain part of the internal audit function but spend a few weeks or even 1 or 2 months each year working in different departments across the organization? almost like a built-in learning rotation where they stay internal auditors but regularly immerse themselves in other parts of the business? Or do you think this would be too complex to organize in practice?
No, it's not a matter of complexity in organizing. If it's important, then you should organize it, no matter how complex it would be. I'm not a believer in short-term assignments. I think learning compounds over time. If you have the model where your internal audit leadership is business-wise, has been on an executive floor, has been in boardrooms, then they can train the younger auditors in that capacity. That's what their role would be. I think the most senior people in internal audit should convey that understanding for how it looks like and feel like in business, because inside internal audit is a business function. It should organize exactly the same way. It should have exactly the same demands on people to stretch themselves and to grow and to develop. So no, I don't think that a few weeks or even a few months would help. In fact, I think it would do a bad service as a young professional may start to get, I would say, trained to dance with management before they fully appreciate what absence of conflict of interest and independence truly means. They need to find strength from within their function. I think that's my view, how I would organize it.
That's a very honest view, Martin. You draw a clear line between routine work and senior judgment. Can you share what the senior judgment looks like in practice for internal auditors who operate at a board level?
The head of internal audit, the head of group audit, or their direct reporting directors who work with executive management, I think the good deal of the impact they can create is in telling a coherent story about what has been tested and what the consequences of what they observed would be for the organization. And that's fact-based, obviously. You don't make it up. You don't share your unfounded opinion, but you present observations in a way that makes sense to inspire senior decision-making. And I see that is lacking, in particular when senior internal audit professionals lack the experience of boardroom or executive board pressures and focus. So life looks very simple when you test, let's say, a sub-process or a few controls in a certain subsidiary. But what's the meaning of a deficiency when you then elevate it to group level? So I think the judgment arrives when the head of group audit or the audit director can make sense of what was tested and how that influences the decision-making, the materiality threshold, be it quantitative or qualitative, at those decision-making bodies. The life looks so different there. The conversation is different. They have very little time to make a small number of important decisions. So they'd like to understand how audit findings contribute to that very complex fabric they have to develop for their decision-making.
Can you share a moment in your career when this purpose really came to life, where internal audit made a decisive difference?
There are many such situations. I've been engaged in either advisory, consulting, co-sourcing, or lead roles maybe for 20 years or 25 years of my career. So obviously the no-brainers are if you or your teams identify material and culture shaping fraud or structures that enable fraud, because that's where audit findings help put the attention on cultural deficiencies that can really kill an organization. And if internal audit comes up with not only individual singular observations, but can do it from a having read data perspective, seeing trends, outliers in entire populations of data, I think that's absolutely relevant for senior leadership or the board. In some of my my assignments, and then as the head of group audit, we developed that kind of capacity to read not only a set of data, but to correlate all types of sets of data against each other. And that allowed us to understand where error, fraud, non-compliance will happen or may happen if it's not addressed. And that then influenced our risk-based audit planning and brought us closer to those topics that were really of interest to senior management and the board. There were some other maybe episodes where I think I could influence at already pretty young age. I was maybe a second-year assistant when I came across for a company who developed large industrial installations, and they were loss-making like crazy, and they had no idea why and where and how this would occur. And so I was asked to test it, and I did some interviews, and I came to conclude that they just don't have the structure to read their data, and they couldn't manage the development and the construction and the calculation and post-calculation of those big installations that would come at a multi-million cost each. So I came up with that, and I remember I spent then an entire week every night when I was done with my work until early morning hours, 4 a.m., 5 a.m. I just came home to take shower, but I spent that on my own risk to develop kind of a tool that allowed management in the different workshops to collect the data and to bring it to decision points. We called it freezing points. And when we had the closing conference, I demonstrated it to management. Mm-hmm. And they were wowed because with consultants and their internal forces, they couldn't nail down what a second-year assistant did within a week of night shifts. And they honored it by calling it the Studel model, which then they implemented in action. And I think for a second-year assistant, it made me feel proud, and it made me feel that I could have an impact on the value creation within that company.
Wow.
So there are a number of such situations. I think my life, I was blessed with being asked to do jobs or engage in tasks that allowed me to leave my mark somehow. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes it was tough. It was exhausting. It was maybe brutally exhausting at times. Was put to the fire. It doesn't matter how senior you are. If you make a claim, you have to back it up. And sometimes you were premature in such roles. I never saw it as a burden. It was always a massive opportunity, and I wouldn't want to miss it.
That's very powerful, Martin, and thank you for sharing that. I think that shows also how much trust and curiosity and stretching yourself. I mean, you just mentioned you worked throughout night on your own cost of sleep, health, energy, getting far out of your comfort zone and create real impact for the business and for you as a becoming leader. Do you think today this is still possible, being at that intersection between an internal auditor providing assurance and on the other side being a partner to the business, provide solution, even if it's not to the extent of your case where you build a solution overnight? Do you think that's still possible, or is this a question, do I work in an internal audit department for a highly regulated organization, or maybe a smaller family-owned or like an industry company where there is more room for such supporting activities?
Yeah, I think it is. And maybe to go back to that little anecdote I shared as a second-year assistant, I shared that anecdote to maybe underpin the Daniel Kahneman behavioral science claim that you can only see things when you're outside the process. I saw things as a second-year assistant. The business couldn't see themselves anymore because they were so much tied up with day-to-day work, with the pressures from their clients and getting things right. As a outsider, I was standing outside and I could look into it, and I thought, that's the missing link. They have no platform where the different workshop leaders and management at different stages can meet. So that was not rocket science. Everyone could do that. But I think to underpin the comments I made before, you need to do that, and from an outside in view. And you need to have leadership who allows you to do that. So it's a cultural element. So I think, yes, these days, obviously, advisory and assurance. There are clear rules, what is permitted and what works and what doesn't work. But in essence, it's still the same. And it goes back to make observations and help management understand the importance of what you came up with. And I think oftentimes auditors are afraid of doing this, to take their observation into a rich business context. And why are they afraid of doing it? Because they've never been on management side or in leadership or in a business process. And that's why it requires senior auditors or directors and head of group audits who have been there, who can bring that courage and then hand it on to their teams. We called it in one of the roles I had, idea meritocracy, where you can really divide and share creativity, no matter how senior people were. And because they trusted that if their thinking was maybe not so smart after all, there would be some who pick it up and guide you into something that is maybe more effective. It has to be part of the equation for auditors to become more of those storytellers. But on the other hand, I think it also requires the CEO of a company in particular and the chairperson of the audit committee, the chairperson of the board, to guide their management to allow these things to happen. It takes both.
Before moving to the next question, a short thought from my side. I think it's really powerful what you bring up here, that management is very often in their day-to-day business so involved, so much under pressure that there's barely room to think outside your own plate in order to get your things done. And I think it's a great value that internal audit can bring at the table if you bring the experience and the understanding of the operations, the culture and the DNA of your organization, and start to share thoughts, maybe outside of the box, and becoming a true sparring partner to the business. When we talk about what's the value of internal audit, I think that's one very strong argument we can have. It requests that you have an entire internal audit team who truly understands the DNA of an organization. Martin, let's start with the three-line model. A framework that is widely viewed as a basis for good governance, yet one that continues to evolve in practice. You have been reflecting on this for many years now. In theory, it meant to bring clarity and collaboration across the lines of management, risk, and assurance. In practice, though, it often seems to create more boundaries than bridges. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between the model's intent and how it works in real life?
As you say, it's a model. And I talked to some of those who were involved in establishing that model at first instance, and they are very clear. It's a model. What is a model? It's something you use as a proxy and then you tweak it to fit the organization. For those internal audit functions or organizations where they take it as the gospel and it's not a model anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think that's maybe the first point. Be aware what it is and what it is not. It's a model. Then I found it a bit unfortunate that this defense was taken out. Now it's the 3 lines model. What does that mean? It doesn't mean too much to me. 3 lines. Okay. 3 lines of defense for me carried a meaning. It defends from embarrassment. When all other involved failed to fix things before they could turn to embarrassment. So I think the 3 lines of defense resonated deeply with me. Each of the lines has a job to do to prevent the organization from failing. And they do it within the context of laws, obviously, regulation eventually, internal policy, strategy, and risk capacity. So that's the playground. And so I think the 3 lines of defense model is a really good model to help explain that there need to be different players to collaborate in order to make an organization robust. How it's implemented, in my view, depends highly on how senior leadership is supporting it. Whether it's observed to be partnering or policing, it depends not only on the auditors. Obviously, the ones who are auditors have been selected, hopefully by the board, and contributed or endorsed by management. So if they chose the wrong people, shame on them. They didn't do their work. So now I can share maybe a little anecdote. I had a new CEO in one of my roles who was very supportive to internal audit and to governance in general. And he told me in one of the first conversations, he would expect that internal audit is truly independent from management. So don't make management your friends, he said. Mm-hmm. The moment you make them your friends, you will lose your edge and your value to the organization. Mm-hmm. Then he would pause and would continue. But if you're so nasty with management that they queue up every single day in front of my office to complain about you, then you took it too far and I would have to remove you. Because then we can't do our business anymore. So find that balance, find that threshold. Don't be the friend of management. Don't try to be the friend of management because you're there to observe things they don't see. But don't do it in a way which is so nasty that it brings the entire productive process to a stop. And I find that this kind of comment was very well received with me and also gave me good guidance for the kind of culture that CEO wanted to establish. I think it was the right way to explain that he puts a lot of trust in what internal audit can do to the organization.
So I hear as a head of internal audit, you don't only need to be an expert in assurance, you really need to be an expert in strategic leadership. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, because oftentimes we have the challenge that an internal auditor, many companies are quite greedy in hiring internal audit capacity. Mm-hmm. And this results in bringing in a head of group audit who, with all due respect, does not play in the same league like group executive leadership. And this creates this kind of imbalance by default, which I don't recommend. You need to bring certain experiences to be respected by those who you audit. I oftentimes would compare it to a soccer game. And when I lecture at university, which I do from time to time, I would always say a referee in a Champions League soccer match is probably the one who earns least of all the active personnel on the field. But the challenge is the referee runs in those 120 minutes, maybe at an average pulse of 170 or even higher. He needs to, or she needs to know all the rules better than any of the players. They need to read the dynamic of the game because the game is only interesting if it pleases the audience as well. So the organizers and the regulators, they want to see that the rules are followed. The game makers, they want to see that it's an attractive game. So the referee is the one who brings clarity to this game, ultimately. And if it's a strong referee, the highest earning players, they respect them a lot. And it's similar with internal audit to some extent, because we need to know the rules of the game. We need to know the policies. We need to earn the respect of those we audit. So that's the power balance. If you manage to do so, then you have a good life. It's a demanding life, but you have a good life.
Martin, you like to use the word a head of internal audit needs to have a certain, in German we call it a Charaktergerüst or a character backbone. What do you exactly mean by this? And looking back to your career, what helped you personally build that executive posture that you have today? And what advice could you give or would you like to share with new or emerging head of internal audit striving to operate at such a level?
It's true for internal auditors, but it's also true, obviously, for other management roles. And some of the anecdotes I shared before maybe point into this direction. It's a matter of your resilience as an individual. And I would break it down into essentially three elements: your emotional, intellectual, and ethical resilience. Mm-hmm. And these three elements are elements you need to peak out as an internal auditor. So let's unpack that. Intellectual resilience means you know as much as an executive committee member or a board member knows. Not only...
Marty, let me stop you right there. Sorry.
Okay.
You're saying a head of internal audit is supposed to know as much as a chief executive officer of an organization. Is this even possible?
You know, it's possible if you bring it into a wider context. First of all, in certain areas, you definitely know more because you spend more time in the details of a process eventually. But it's also involving some other spheres of life. In order to have a dialogue with a senior individual, you need to know what they think, what they talk about, how they shaped their perspectives. So if they traveled the world, you eventually know how it feels to travel the world. If they live in a high-paced environment where there's a lot of risk, you need to know how that feels, and you need to talk this way. So I give you an example in my life. Since I left university, I always get up in the morning, very, very early morning hours, and I start reading. I read management literature. I go into economic reports. It's a permanent learning. 1.5 hours every day.
Wow.
That's in 360 days. It's about 500 hours of learning in a year. How does that compound if you do that for 35 years in your life? So you know a lot. You don't need all of that, but it gives you a certain structure that allows you to take your observations and your conversations into a context that is understood by those you talk to. I think that's the point. Second, it's about emotional resilience. This means you can't get stressed that easily. You don't take everything personal. You can take yourself back and say, I'm a catalyst in that process. If someone yells at me, it happens from time to time along my career. I was young auditor again, and a client would really yell at me. You get intimidated. So I got nervous. I got defensive. And over time, I had mentors and leaders who told me, don't worry, you're a catalyst. They can yell at you as much as they want. It tells more about them than it does about you. So you need to learn that. Some do it intuitively. Some others, like me, had to learn that you are a catalyst in that process. And then this brings you into this ethical environment. This means if you work for a global group, which is present, let's say, in 70 countries, and you've never left your home country, really, except for a few weeks of holiday on a beach, how would you know how management members from those geographies think, how they feel, how they arrive at their decisions, and whether or not they pursue a joint purpose of the company? You need to develop your ethical understanding that in an international global environment, you've got all different cultures, all different religions working together. And only if you build that by exposing yourself to the stress that comes from maybe stepping around a little bit in an awkward way in other cultures, they will tell you politely that you maybe didn't really find the tone. I remember doing audits in Japan. With the benefit of hindsight, I'm still embarrassed how culturally unaware I behaved. But I learned. I built respect for different perspectives, for different approaches. And I think the auditor needs to bring these three things together. And maybe the last element on Charaktergerüst, as you mentioned it, the backbone you bring is maybe these three elements help you to not think of what may happen if you get fired. Mm-hmm. Many feel, okay, that would be quite an embarrassment to my social environment. It would put me financially at risk. Many different worries, which are justified worries, real worries. But I think a good head internal audit should not do their job from a position of worry. They should say, I'm intellectually, emotionally, ethically savvy and robust and can stand tall, whatever happens, because you're hired for that one moment when things really get wrong and the stakes are high, and you get measured whether you then stand tall, deliver your message at your personal risk of getting eventually fired. It was the wrong company. Your team looks up to you to have their back when they are not strong enough. So that's how I look at it. And I think the selection process to senior audit personnel, be it directors or head offs, should go through that lens. We did in some of the roles I had psychometrics to better understand how individuals would react under pressure. Where's the threshold where they would bend, where they would crack? And that's an important selection criteria, I think, for a head of internal audit.
I really like what you're saying, yet it sounds like an extremely demanding and aspirational picture of internal audit with intellectual, emotional, and ethical strengths at true executive level. So what would you recommend a head of internal audit or members of the internal audit team to do very concretely to build this kind of strengths in an organization?
Yeah.
And then I have a second thought to that. which I also observe, what should they do if they sense that the leadership actually doesn't even want them to operate at that level?
That's a good one. Maybe the second one first. Run. If the organization doesn't support the right thing, if you are ambitious, if you have a lot of self-esteem or sufficient level of self-esteem, walk. Spend your time wisely where it's appreciated. That's why I say you need to not be afraid of walking if it's just the wrong environment. And if you don't see a way to fix it, then you have to move. The other one is maybe more an advice to the younger auditors. Because if you arrive at a very senior role and you haven't developed your resilience in those three fields, then it's probably too late. And for younger auditors, I would say the first thing is start reading every day, a wide scope of things. Develop your intellectual resilience. The more you read across categories, the less it's likely that you could be emotionally challenged for not being competent. And this may start with technical literature, but soon it goes into management literature. From there, it goes maybe into political literature. And this makes you stronger and more resilient than also emotionally. And here, I think you will always get stressed in situations when things go wrong or the stake is high and the risk is high. And there, you need to train that. So early in your career, it's easy to train it because you can raise your hand and say, I'm in for that job. And you will most likely find leaders, managers, peers who coach you into taking that risk. And I give you a little anecdote. I was responsible, probably prematurely. I was still a senior manager. Then I turned partner in leading a massive risk-loaded engagement where I had at times about 200 people working to that engagement, high pressure, national interest. And I worked maybe 1.5 years into it, and I was a young partner at the end. But at one point, I realized I cannot bring it to an end. I can't collect all these tens of thousands of pages of work that was done into a coherent, strong, neutral report. So I knew that may be the end of my stellar so far career in my company. And so I had to go to the managing partner for the weekly briefing. And I told exactly this. I said, I failed the objective of what I was asked to do. I just have to tell you. And I was prepared that he would release me. And then he stared at me, kind of vacuum eyes, and it was this really painful silence. He just stared at me, and I knew he wanted to download all information from my brain, through my eyes, from my brain, to understand how severe it is. Then he paused. At that time, we still had paper schedules, and he took a black pen and started to look into his schedule for the coming months, and he started to blacken every single day line. And I watched him doing this. And then after a while, he folded it, put it away, and said, Martin, now I have time for you. Let's go back to work and do that together.
Wow, that's strong. Yeah.
So this gave me, first of all, an idea for what leadership really means. It's about letting your team go into the heat and pressure up until the point when the mission will get at risk, and then to step in and to take the heat and the pressure. And he demonstrated that to me. I will never forget what master lesson he gave me here. So that's what I would recommend to young auditors: to go into that pressure and hope for kind managers who don't let you burn, but lead you to your threshold. And on the ethical element, I think whenever you come up with a conclusion that sounds a little bit harsh or too obvious, try to look at it through a different perspective. Try to look at it through a lens of the ones who were involved in creating that situation. So what were the incentives they had? What were the internal pressures they had to deal with? What is their personal environment about? So it may not remove the fraud, the error, or the non-compliance they contributed to, but it will make you human in the way how you deal with them, how you interact with them so they feel more comfortable in taking accountability. And the earlier you do that in your career, the better you can build it. And the more you build it, the more you become known for that capacity, and you can further stretch into more mastery level of doing exactly this.
This brings us to the end of part 1 of my conversation with Martin. If you enjoyed this episode, do not miss part 2, where we continue exactly where we stopped and go even deeper into the future of internal audit and assurance. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to having you with us again in the second part of this episode.